The Big Ten tournament is over. The NCAA tournament coming up this week. Not even weekend. Thursday through Sunday, the NCAA's Greg Pickel, our wrestling insider, coming to tell us about what to expect from Penn State in the NCAA tournament. Is it another championship run for the Nittany Lions? What happened to the Big Ten? How does that affect all of what's going to happen over the next 4 days at the end of the week? So, Greg, welcome to the show. Thanks for making time for us.
Hey, T. Frank, it's good to be with you on a Monday. We're fired up for NCAA Tournament week, as you mentioned. And, for Penn State, it's about time to just go out there on the mat and do it. As we're going to get into here, there were some, I think, things with the seeding that Penn State wasn't happy about. Its fans certainly were not happy about. And I think that some of that stuff will have an impact on this tournament. But overall, Penn State, Cael Sanderson, his 9 wrestlers going to Detroit where this year's tournament will be held. They just have to be ready to go out and wrestle from the first match of their respective weight class. So as long as they do that, they'll be able to take care of business.
Yeah, and also, we've been saying for about 3 weeks now that Penn State football is around the corner. And it's actually true. We're 7 days away from the start of spring practice, so we'll be getting into a little bit of a spring preview with Greg and some of the things he's thinking about as we are just outside of things actually happening. But let's start with wrestling, and let's start with Drew Hilderbrant. I want to back up to the Big Ten tournament. Struggled in the Big Ten tournament, led to a poor seeding in the NCAA tournament. What happened there from the Big Ten standard and situation that led to the NCAA seeding, and what's the disconnect?
Yeah, I think obviously, Cael Sanderson summed it up best when he said it was kind of a surprise and they didn't really expect him to fall all the way to where he did. But, at the end of the day, you have to be able to, we hear it all the time and it's cliche and people don't like cliches, blah, blah, blah. But it's true. You have to control the controllables, T. Frank. And Drew Hilderbrant, given the opportunity to control in at least some respect where he would end up being seated, was not very good at the Big Ten tournament, and that dropped him to number 16 seed. He'll face Anthony Noto of Lock Haven in the 16-17 match to start the 125-pound tournament there in Detroit. But the winner of that gets Nick Sirianni of Michigan, who's the top seed. And so that's what he has led himself to. And again, you can make the argument that he shouldn't have fell that far and that there needs to be some flexibility with the way this process works in terms of the seeds are basically determined by a formula between a coach's poll and an RPI ranking. And there's not really any way for, they say it's a selection committee, right? But it's more just a selection group of people who run the numbers and then sign off on them,
So there's no individual sort of human element. It's all about what the numbers say. And then you go with the numbers, which can be skewed by something, right? And It doesn't take into the picture the wrestler or their competition. Is that sort of the issue?
Well, yeah, I think that there should be some ability to. So there is a bit of a human element in terms of the coaches poll, and that those coaches voting on the kind of the ranking of things at each weight class. And then the seeds are kind of made in part that way, but there's no ability to stop and say, a good example of this, Drew Hilderbrant, not necessarily the greatest one, but Brady Berge, I think, is probably a better example. He beat a guy from Iowa twice in the 157-pound Big Ten tournament, and yet he was seated, I think it was 5 or 6 spots at least lower than the guy he had just beat twice 2 weekends before, or 8 weekend before rather. And there should be a way for the selection committee to say, maybe we need to tweak this a little bit because maybe this guy who, just didn't beat another wrestler once via fluke, he actually beat him twice. And even though he doesn't have as many matches as a lot of these other guys because he didn't come back until January, and then he wrestled 165 before he dropped to 157 for the postseason, there should be an ability for him to look at this and say, okay, hold on a second. We need to rethink this. Even though the criteria is this, the results were that. So how can we meet in the middle best as possible? So I think that's what Cael Sanderson and what many other coaches are going to push for this offseason. But at the end of the day, if you go back and watch Cael Sanderson's news conference, or if you read the story over at Blue White Illustrated, he also made another very good point, T. Frank, which is that this is not the first time in the history of the NCAA wrestling tournament this has happened. In fact, it happens every single year. And so maybe they will change the approach here, but at the same time, I think it's fair to say that if they were going to change it, why wouldn't they change it by now if it's been such a problem for so many years?
Yeah.
So we'll see. But it's
It's not
a
even
lot of questions, not a lot of answers.
It's not even the first sport where there's been a problem with the ranking
Right.
system. And I think he also made a good point that pretty much every team is going to be unhappy with something when it comes to the seeding,
Right.
because that's, you're vying for your position and somebody's going to be disappointed. Penn State had a
Right.
couple of seeds they didn't like. And I think from a logic perspective, you can kind of see why that might be. So
Yeah.
one last
I'll
thing.
just
Sorry,
say
go
one-
ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, one final thought there, but take it wherever you'd like. But, I think the biggest thing, T. Frank and Cael Sanderson said this, is that there just has to be consistency, right? I mean,
Right.
if you're going to do things this way, that's fine. But then there should be never any question about everyone being treated the same way, I
Right.
guess. And when you look through the brackets, there are some instances where you feel like that maybe there was some human element added to the process. And then there's others where that was definitely not the case. So it is what it is. But yeah, ultimately, I think that what they need to do is come up. And I don't know what the perfect system is. I don't know if anyone has that answer right now, but I just think it's something that is equitable, that is defensible. And I'm not sure they have that right now.
When it comes to, before we get to the NCAA tournament, was there some disappointment in not winning the Big Ten tournament, win the Big Ten regular season, don't get that second box checked before heading on to the NCAAs? Was there a sense of disappointment? Or, as you've mentioned before, Cael Sanderson is all about winning a national championship, winning as many of those as possible. So what's the kind of view of what happened the other weekend in Lincoln?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good instructive example of what Penn State can't do if it wants to win the national title. And look, I understand that they gear up for nationals and they wrestle for nationals, and that's what they focus on from the 124/7 365 is the phrase I'm looking for. But at the same time, it's not like you want to hand away the conference crown to Michigan. And I'm not saying Penn State did that. Michigan wrestled really, really well and earned it. But at the same time, T. Frank, when you go back through and just think about some of these areas where Penn State lost points, obviously when you lose by 1.5 points, Drew Hilderbrant even winning one consolation match that mattered for the team race could have changed things. They had some guys who won by decision, 1 point away from a major, and another half bonus point that they weren't able to pick up. So, and then when Aaron Brooks loses in the finals by via upset, I mean, you can't blame one guy or one situation for losing the Big Ten tournament by 1.5 points. There was a lot of chances for a lot of guys across the lineup to score enough points to win or beat a Michigan guy heads up to help secure the deal, and they weren't able to get it done. But no one's going to remember that Penn State didn't win the Big Ten title if Penn State wins the national title, right? So that, it's kind of that mantra that we hear from the coaches, James Franklin, Cael Sanderson, I'm sure Micah Shrewsbury, everyone else in the coaching world, that, you got to look ahead, not backwards, right? So you can lament that they didn't win it and all that, but at the end of the day, you have to be ready to now go wrestle a better tournament in Detroit. So, the takeaway for me is I think you saw some things, especially from Brady Berge, but it was one who stands out. Bo Bartlett, another one. Guys, so you're going to need some points from at nationals that are probably not going to end up in the finals, but if they can somehow find their way through, and again, the other thing on this seeding stuff too, T. Frank, is so okay, you don't want to be the 16 seed because you don't want to wrestle the number one guy in the second round, but you're probably going to have to wrestle that guy at some point anyway if you want to win the title. So, at some point there is also a component to all this that is just go out and win your matches, go out and beat the guys opposite you for 7 minutes and see what you're left with at the end of the day. So, I think Penn State fans should not be worrying that the seeding outcomes ruin their chances to fight for a Big Ten, or I'm sorry, an NCAA team title. That's just not the case. Would they have loved to have sent all 10 guys to Detroit and, get Creighton Etzel and at-large bid at 165? Yes, but, that wasn't in the cards. So they have just 9 going there, and that, some other schools do have the full amount going, so that will be something they have to contend with. But ultimately, it is what it is. And if they wrestle the way they can wrestle, it's not out of the question that they will leave Detroit with a NCAA title.
And you mentioned, I think you said you were projecting 8 or 9 getting to the NCAA tournament.
Yes.
So you're spot on with that. Did it play out the way you expected? Was it the 8 or 9 you were expecting? Or were there some, with the seedings, is this a little bit surprising about how it played out?
No, I think it went pretty much as expected. Again, I think some of these guys are seated a little bit lower. If I would have sat down, I thought the full disclosure, I thought the seats were coming out a different time. So I didn't necessarily go through all of them and try and predict where Penn State was going to fall beforehand. And it almost would have been a useless task anyway, T Frank, because until you see the coaches poll and the RPI rankings that go into this formula, you can try and figure it out based on outside rankings, but it really wouldn't matter. So at any rate, no, I mean, some of these guys are definitely a little bit lower than I thought they would be. Others might be higher than you thought they would be. But, at the end of the day, I think it makes sense. I think that going into the Big Ten tournament, if you were thinking that Penn State was going to get 8 or 9 through to nationals, that it was going to be one of Brady Berge, Bo Bartlett, or Creighton Etzel that did not make it. And it ended up being Creighton Etzel, who I thought actually wrestled halfway, not poorly at Big Tens, but at the end of the day, it was about, when Penn State brought Brady Berge back at 65 and then decided to drop him to 57, it created two problems. One is that Berge was not going to have maybe enough matches at 157 to get the seed that Penn State fans think he deserves. And then Creighton Etzel was going to sit on the sidelines for a month and a half before coming back into the mix. And, those were two risks Penn State took. Do I think they were the right risk to take? Absolutely. But did you know that there was going to possibly be some issues because of it? Yeah, no question. So that's where we're at this point. But, again, Penn State does get 9 guys there, and they'll take it. They love 10. Yes, of course. But they will take what they have at this point in time.
So Penn State clearly has a couple number one seeds, but with that in mind, who do you think has the best path to a championship, maybe outside of those guys, and then we can get to them at the end?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, T. Frank, because it can be hard to guess just simply based off the fact that the Big Ten tournament I think is more challenging. Most people anyway believe it's more challenging than the NCAA tournament, and there's some thought I think behind that. Obviously, if you're a Penn State wrestler and you are just you're going to see a lot of these guys at the NCAA tournament. I haven't looked at the allocator and basically the allocations in that large combination to see if the Big Ten has the most wrestlers here, but I'd be stunned if it does not. So, when you look at the guys who won the Big Ten tournament or were in the finals matches, I mean, I think obviously, when you look at Roman Bravo Young, when you look at Nick Lee, Max Dean, these guys, Carter Starachi, and Aaron Brooks too, even though he didn't win the Big Ten title. Those are your guys who you're expecting to possibly go win it all. Greg Kirkfleet at heavyweight is not, I don't believe, beating Gable Stevenson from Minnesota. I just don't think anyone's beating that guy unless he gets hurt. So, you can probably cross 285 off the list. You can probably cross, Brooks is going to have to repeat at nationals. He's going to have to, avenge his loss in the Big Ten tournament is the word I'm looking for. I'm not sure I see Brady Berge winning a title, but he was so impressive at Big Tens that you just never know. I wouldn't rule it out. And then you have, of course, Bo Bartlett at 149. I don't think we're going to see him on the top podium, but RBY certainly, and at 33, and Nick Lee at 41. And then with Drew Hilderbrant, I guess we'll see. He's a 2-time All-American.
Yeah.
He would have to beat Nick Siriano in round 2 to qualify for that. And then, Bergey's in the same situation. He'd have to beat the top guy at his weight, whose name escapes me at the moment, but I will find it here as I blabber. But yeah, so David Carr, Iowa State, is who he'd have to get in round 2. So, again, you're going to have to beat these guys at some point. It's not like you can avoid them in all likelihood for the entire tournament. So, if you're a Penn State wrestler, I think you have to accept the challenge that's ahead of you. If you're Drew Hilderbrant, you know what you're getting in Nick Siriano. You've seen him before. And if you're Brady Berge, it's interesting to me, T. Frank, that most of these guys don't care who they're wrestling in the first round or the second round. It's about what they do.
Right.
Max Dean was asked about that, and he said if someone told him he was wrestling, that would be fine. But at the end of the day, he doesn't really want to know, prefers not to know, doesn't care. Nick Lee felt the same way, which I thought was interesting, but it just goes to show you the mentality of a Penn State wrestler. And of course, many teams, schools, wrestlers, but certainly the mindset Cael Sanderson preaches is, we're going to focus on what we do. We're going to try and go score a bunch of points. And at the end of the day, if we do those two things to the best of our ability, the match will take care of itself.
So I'm assuming Michigan is one of the teams contending for a national title this year, seeing as they beat Penn State in the Big Ten tournament. But who are the teams that are the biggest contenders outside of the Nittany Lions for a national championship? And then I'll ask you your prediction after that. So what do you think are the teams to know for Penn State this year?
Yeah, I just have a hard time, T. Frank. Look, any team can get hot at any given time, right? I mean, I think that we all know that that's the case, but I don't know if I see anyone out competing Penn State and Michigan here. Yeah, I think it's a two-team race. And, will there be some other teams that are in the mix, especially on Thursday and Friday when the team standings are in a more preliminary state? Yes. But after watching those guys at the Big Ten tournament and the way they all competed and the number of wrestlers they have going to NCAAs, I just don't know if I don't know how anyone, barring a major surprise, well, lots of them actually, could overcome Michigan or Penn State. So to me, it's a two-team race. Penn State lost Drew Hilderbrant to the 9th, 10th place match, which didn't even count for team points after just 2 matches. Penn State lost in the finals in what I think most would consider an upset in the Brooks Amin match at 184. So all of these things, it kind of transpired in Michigan's favor, and they still only won by 1.5. So to me, my prediction would be based on what I've seen over the last couple of weekends, but also just the last couple of months in terms of the entire season, tells me that Penn State should be considered a favorite here. They're in the catbird seat. They will have to go earn it, and nothing will be handed to them. But based on what I've seen, I just have a hard time picking anybody else at this point.
It's so just learning about all these things, and that's one of the things you've been pretty consistent about since we've started doing this segment on the show. As we got closer to the NCAAs, as Penn State is the favorite, and they continue to be the favorite. One small piece of mortality, one small upset here or there is a huge difference along the way, and it's just fascinating how that happens one time, and then not to say that Penn State isn't the prohibitive favorite, but there is more of a conversation, I think, now than there was a week and a half ago, and as Cael Sanderson said, you just got to go out and wrestle and do your best, and I think that they have the right formula for all of these things when it comes to scoring points, making sure you really go for it, and that's the right way to do that, and do they have the wrestlers to do that? It seems like even with 9, they're in the advantage there. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. And if you want people to follow along with how you're covering Penn State's NCAA Tournament Championship bid, tell me, where can we get that information?
Yeah, so T. Frank, if you want to join us to follow Penn State wrestling all weekend long, as you mentioned, the tournament is Thursday through Saturday. It airs on ESPNU. We're going to have a front page post at bluewhiteillustrated.com that will keep you up to date as all the action unfolds during each session. And then also over on the Wrestling Room Forum, we'll be discussing things as the matches happen. So please feel free to join us. Remember, just $1 for 1 year of access to Blue White Illustrated and on 3. So be sure to check that out if you haven't yet. And yeah, it is a big week for Penn State wrestling, no doubt, and a big week for Penn State in general. Spring break is over, T. Frank.
Yeah.
Recruiting's about to pick back up. Spring practice is almost here. Wrestling tournament weekend is here. Just a lot of stuff going on, a lot of excitement, and Penn State fans should be gearing up for what is a busy few weeks on the horizon.
Absolutely. Now, it already aired today, but you can always catch the re-air on YouTube whenever you like, and the podcast version. BWI Live today, we talked about the position battles for spring football. We're down to position battles. It is here. It's still a week away, but it's here. We're talking about spring football in detail, so we'll get into that. Make sure you check that out. And, of course, subscribe to Blue White Illustrated so you don't miss any of the information, including when we go live, which I'll give you a secret. It's every Monday at noon, unless there's a special circumstance. You can join us there, ask questions live in the show, and, of course, catch the replay whenever you'd like here on YouTube. And if you subscribe, hit the notification button. You don't miss anything. And if you do that and sign up for the $1 deal for BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, the whole thing costs you $1. It is a great deal. So let's get into spring football a little bit. What are you interested in learning when it comes to what you're projecting for Penn State spring football? So just kind of a big picture, and then we'll drill down into some of the other things in just a second.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me, T. Frank, is number one, I want to see the new guys, right? The early enrollees, Mitchell Tinsley. I want to get a look at them in pads because we saw them in the weight room, and that was, well, some of them anyway. They weren't all there, but that was great and all. But I don't know about you, and maybe this is silly, but to me, I just, no matter what I think I know about a guy, no matter what I think his possible role could be this year, next year, moving on, whatever, I just always don't know if I believe it 100% until I see him in pads and say either, oh yeah, he looks like he's ready to go, or yeah, maybe not quite yet like we thought when he was running around in t-shirts and shorts or against high school competition. When this is probably not a good example, but I'm pretty confident in saying that when Nick Singleton stands next to Noah Kane, you're going to know that, you might, if you didn't know, you might not know which guy is a veteran running back just
Right.
based on how they look in pads and helmets. But a guy like Amari Evans, on the other hand, is obviously going to take a couple years to put on the kind of weight needed to play in the Big Ten. You are going to notice a very stark difference between him and, say, Parker Washington or Keandre Lambert-Smith. So I always like that is probably my favorite part of the first day of spring practice when it's open to reporters and us in the media, is just to get a look at those guys and say, okay, they definitely look ready. They definitely look this, that, or the other thing. So, I mean, beyond that, it is really, I've been doing this series over at Blue White Illustrated, kind of doing a question every couple of days that looks at the big question facing a certain coach.
Yeah.
And, the more I keep thinking about that as I get ready to go into Ty Howe and filter outline and then get on to the defense, the one challenge here, T. Frank, is that what Penn State fans want: a better running game, a more consistent offense, better quarterback play. What is Manny Diaz going to look like, etc.
Yep.
Spring practice is not really going to answer a lot of those questions. I mean,
especially on the defensive side of the ball. If you think you're seeing
right.
any sort of intricate thing that's going to be a part of the defense next year,
right.
you're going to see vanilla the whole time.
Right. Exactly. So, it's always the interesting part of spring practice. There are some things you can answer clear cut, and there are some things where, even though they may be the most important part of previewing the season, you're just not going to be able to get the answers you think you're going to.
Yeah.
Until the fall.
One guy that we keep hearing about, and I guess I'm continually surprised because I genuinely know, even going back to his high school film, that I know nothing about, is Harrison Wallace, but he keeps cropping up as a guy that the offensive coaches are touting. I know when we were at conditioning day, Chuck Losey mentioned him as a guy that had taken a real step forward this year. That position, and I guess that's going to be my next question, is this is kind of my opening kind of thought when it comes to position battles. Get your idea on a couple that are standing out to you. One guy in one position is Harrison Wallace, in that boundary position opposite of Mitchell Tinsley, whom I'm expecting that's who is going to be the starter over there. Where is Harrison Wallace lining up, and what is his skill set? What is he doing? Who is he battling with? Because he's clearly, of the young players, the redshirt freshman, the one we're hearing the most about. So I'm interested in that. What position battles are you focusing on? Are you thinking about heading into the first day a week from now?
Well, I mean, it depends on, I can give you my opinion, but I think as always is the case, we all just basically want to see what we think people are going to either read or talk about or listen to here on the BWI Daily. So, I mean, to me, I want to see where that first offensive line group lines up. Where's Landon Tangwall? Is he at guard? Presumably. Where's Caden Wallace? Is he at tackle? Presumably. But, I want to see it in person, in the flesh. So that's one thing. And another thing, of course, is, we spent, I'm trying to figure out how much time we spent talking about spring practice now without mentioning that, yes, Sean Clifford will be the starting first up guy for Penn State at quarterback here in 2022 spring practice. So let me just get that out of the way. But, I'm curious to see too, Khalil Dinkins in this tight end room. Obviously they returned everyone: Theo Johnson, Brenton Strange, and Tyler Warren. But I thought Khalil Dinkins looked pretty well put together when he was at the weightlifting session we were able to attend. So I'm curious to see if he has a role this year. And one of those tight ends, just like one of those running backs, has to really step up, T. Frank, in my opinion, and take the bull by the horns and make themselves the guy.
Let me ask you about that particular at the tight end position, because the point about last season was it wasn't going to be one guy. They were all going to step up, and they were all going to be a factor. And to a certain degree, I would say there was some truth to that, with Tyler Warren having a role and coming on late at the end of the season. And then you had Brenton Strange, who turned out to be the best run blocker, and then Theo Johnson, who was the best, was the receiving tight end by the end of the season, based on the numbers and the targets. So there was an element of that, but I don't think anyone would say that the tight end room as a group stepped up. Do you think that we can see something similar with an elevated level of play, or do you really think that somebody has to distinguish themselves as the guy and then the other two are support players around him?
I have a tough time with rotations in a lot of respects because it feels like to me sometimes when you have two starters at a position, all it really means is you don't have one.
Right.
And so that's not always the case, certainly. And I think that if there's ever going to be a exception to that rule, it could be with this tight end group, because obviously Theo Johnson's played a ton. Brenton Strange has played a ton. We've seen a little bit more of Tyler Warren, who obviously has shown that he can play in a variety of different roles. So I wouldn't rule it out, but to me, T. Frank, I feel like when you're rotating guys and saying you have two starters at a position, that rule maybe didn't apply as much to Jesse Luketa and Nick Tarburton, because Luketa was basically the only one playing starter reps there. They weren't splitting. There was no 50-50 share at defensive end, even though Penn State announced both of those guys as starters on the video board before the game. So, I mean, that is maybe one example of that not being the case. But yeah, to me, I just always prefer when you have a guy who is just so good, either in practice or the game, that you can't take him off the field. I think that makes it's an obvious statement, but I just think that if you have two guys like that, great, find a way to use them. But, if you go back to a lot of what you have said on here and also on the site, Mike Yurcich does not exactly have a long background of tight end success.
Right.
That's the one spot where his offense is, for whatever reason, not really taken off. So, point being there that, if you're Penn State, I think that, you got to find a way to get those guys more involved. But I'm just not convinced that if they end up with, two guys playing each half the starter reps, that's necessarily the best way forward for this team in 2022 on offense.
Yeah, and if you have two tight ends on the field, who are you taking off of the football field? So, you're not in a 3 receiver set. The questions about Harris and Wallace don't matter. There is one thing I would say, and I would push back a little bit, that the H-back position and what Brenton Strange does is slightly different than what the other two true inline tight ends are when it comes to Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren. But Strange also lines up at traditional tight end. So there's some flexibility to get guys on the football field and have kind of a quasi 21 personnel where you have two running backs. But we're splitting hairs here. This is like the conversation about the linebacker position in Jonathan Sutherland. It's like, is it 6 of one or half dozen of the other? And it might not matter in the end. But yeah, when it comes to that position, Penn State has been traditionally best when they have one player that is clearly the best, and then guys that can come in and have sub-package roles, because it gives your offense stability and you don't need to rotate as much. What non-position battle information are you looking for this period? We mentioned we're not going to get a lot of detail from Manny Diaz and the structure of his defense. What are you looking for in sort of non-personnel, non-position battle news that's going to inform something to you about the state of football heading into the fall?
Yeah, this is going to sound kind of stupid, T. Frank, but I always want to watch how they practice. Like we've seen for eight years, because Brent Pry and Bob Shoop were pretty much exactly the same. Like there really wasn't anything that changed when Pry took over in terms of individual drills or things like that. So it's been very consistent now for 8 years. So I'm just going to be curious to see the few chances we get to go to spring practice, what is different? What is changed or tweaked, or and it would be just as interesting, did Manny Diaz come here and James Franklin said, this is the way we do these things, here we go, get on board, let's get moving. So I'd be curious about that. And then tackling too, I think, is obviously the big thing. And I'm not saying tackling like, they're going to start suddenly hitting in practice every single day. Number one, they can't. Number two, they wouldn't. But I want to see how he teaches it differently than maybe Ren Pry did in that tag off. How do you teach fundamentals of something that you're asking a guy not to do? I guess that's what I'm getting at here.
Right.
So, yeah, so that I will be it sounds very generic and vague, but just the way that he runs practice and the way that he pushes his players, I think is going to be very insightful early on. Because to your point, everything we see is going to be vanilla. But I will say this: who's the other safety beside Brown? Who gets the first shot at a Keaton Ellis or Jalen Reed? I would be willing to bet Reed, but we'll see.
Is that your view of it as well, that Keaton Ellis has moved over to that other safety position? Because that was something I was looking at this weekend, and I wrote about it over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Is it seems like Penn State have 4 safeties, which is a good depth that they typically have 4, and then a couple other scholarship guys that are growing and developing. Enzo Jennings, Tyler Rudolph, they move on, so there's a lack of that quasi-veteran depth there. But it feels like Penn State moving Zakee Wheatley over has 3 good safety positions at the free safety position, but that boundary strong safety, they got to make something happen, and all of their good reinforcements are coming later in the year. So is that kind of your view of what's going to happen at that safety that Keaton Ellis moves over?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think at this point that makes, right. And, again, you put it well today, but there's a couple of positions where, man, they're going to have some numbers issues during spring practice. I just don't see any way around it. I mean, there are just some spots that are very light right now. And there are help is on the way in the terms of signees, maybe not guys who will play right away at all of those positions. But I just think whenever we talk about this, T. Frank, or whatever I read what you wrote over the weekend or, what have you, it just becomes clear that, some Penn State fans are sort of freaking out like, hey, where's the transfer portal additions? What's going on here? And one, if we talked about, they're not easy. But then number 2, they're still probably coming. And if you don't think that, just take a closer look at the depth chart and the roster and all of that. And you're going to see pretty quickly that, there's some numbers issues here that they're probably going to have to address via the portal.
Yep. The last thing I'm interested in, and I'll just throw this in as a non-football thing or a non-personnel thing, is just how crisp is the offense in year 2? Right. And some of the higher level things that I want to know, you mentioned the tight end. How does Mike Yurcich, having 3 tight ends, what has he learned from his first season in this system, and how can he adapt it to get those guys on the field? And just in general, how to use that position. We're not going to see a ton of that when it comes to this. But how crisp is the offensive line? How much better do the players understand what they're supposed to do? And how do they, and this is something that we were talking on the message board, another reason to sign up for $1 is you get inside information and access, and we have these conversations first on the Lions Den message board, is that communication along the offensive line was an issue last season. How do you get players to communicate? Because you can tell them, like if you watch a basketball game, you can see the coaches sometimes yelling at them to talk. You can't make guys talk. How do you make guys talk, and how do you get the right group out there of people that are willing to lead, willing to listen, and willing to support in the process of the offensive line in particular, but then spread that out to the running game and pass protection, all those things. So I'm interested in all of that stuff to see just if it's clean, it's crisp, and there aren't a bunch of looking around, staring at each other, like what happened there. Last thing, just kind of a general, what else are you thinking of? Closing thoughts when it comes to spring practice coming up in a week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just glad it's here, right? I mean, that's just I'm quite excited that we're on this verge here of things changing because at the end of the day, T. Frank, Penn State is in a pretty pivotal year here. I mean, and when you're going through winter workouts and you're looking back at the season that it just ended, 2 months ago, even though it feels more like about 2 years have passed between since now and then. But
that's a good point.
But, and you think about all this stuff and then, that's great. And it's awesome to talk about it. It passes the time. But, getting the chance to interact with these guys, the coaches, the players, see them in person, I think really is the best way to inform your opinion about how this team can improve between these 15 practices and then, of course, moving forward. So, time will tell on how ultimately all of this shakes out. But, to me, I think it's great that this time of year is here, and it's an important one. Penn State must take advantage of it, no question.
Always awesome talking to Greg Pickel, our reporter for Blue White Illustrated. Greg, thanks for the time today.
All right. Thank you, T. Frank.
Make sure you subscribe to Blue White Illustrated wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as always. And if the outro music is playing, if you like the video that much to stay here to this point, give the video a like. It's always super helpful. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr. We will be back tomorrow.